My name is Rudy Gonzalez, and I am an Equal Employment Specialist with the USDA's National Institute of Food and Agriculture. This day's presentation will be on implicit bias. The objectives for this presentation are to define Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, define the USDA's non-discrimination statement, define explicit and implicit bias, define 5 inclusive habits that can be utilized to be aware of and change behaviors relating to implicit bias, discuss ways to address biases, and discuss the importance of diversity. Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 says that no person shall, on the grounds of race, color, or national origin, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subject to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal assistance. Title VI is often referred to as federally assisted programs. It is important to note that even if the program is federally funded and not actually conducted by the agency, it is still subject to Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This is the USDA's non-discrimination statement. It's important that we go over this statement because it will relate to our discussion on implicit bias and how sometimes our implicit biases can affect our decision-making ability and may be discriminatory in nature. Starting with the first paragraph of the USDA's non-discrimination statement. In accordance with federal civil rights law and the U.S. Department of Agriculture's civil rights regulations and policies, the USDA, its agencies, offices, and employees, as well as institutions participating in or administering USDA programs, are prohibited from discrimination based on race, color, national origin, religion, sex, gender identity, including gender expression, sexual orientation, disability, age, marital status, family or parental status, income derived from a public assistance program, political beliefs, or reprisal for prior civil rights activity in any program or activity conducted or funded by the USDA. A link to the USDA non-discrimination statement is provided on the slide. When you have a moment, follow that link and review the full version of the statement. The full version of the statement provides additional information relating to persons with disabilities and how to file a program complaint. Let's talk about what happens in our mind as it relates to bias. As humans, we have a tendency and need to classify information, including individuals, into categories. This is a fairly quick and automatic process that we tend not to even realize. When we think about biases, it's important to recognize that everyone has them. It's the unconscious classification that most often occurs behind or below your level of consciousness. Creating schemas are mental maps that are developed from life experiences that aid in the fast processing of information. It's important to emphasize that this occurs unconsciously. It's not something that you would typically be aware of that is occurring behind the scenes. When you have these mental maps or unconscious classifications of people, groups, or things, it creates a template for future classification. When you have these classifications, the next time you encounter a particular person or group, your mind may unconsciously refer back to that previous mental map. Allowing your mind to take a new experience or encounter and tie it to a previous experience, allowing you to react according to that prior experience. If you're not aware this is occurring in the background, you might not notice that it's affecting how you operate and how you make decisions. There are two types of bias, explicit and implicit biases. Explicit biases are attributes or beliefs about a person or group that you're aware of. Some examples of explicit biases may be a prejudice or racist comments. These are explicit biases because the individual is aware that they have these thoughts about a specific person or group. Implicit biases is that subconscious feeling, perception, attitude, or stereotype that develops from a previous experience, creating those imprints or mental maps that we talked about before that occur automatically. Some examples of implicit bias are gender bias, similarity bias, or conformity bias. Let's talk a little more about implicit bias. Implicit bias is an automatic positive or negative preference for a group, individual, or thing. Implicit biases can come from a childhood or adult experience. They can form from interactions with a particular person or for something you may have seen on TV or social media. Implicit biases only require knowledge of a stereotype, not that you believe that stereotype to be true, but just having knowledge of the stereotype can affect you and cause the implicit bias. Like I mentioned before, if there's something you saw maybe on the news or social media that portrays a stereotype, simply having knowledge of that stereotype can affect or become a factor in implicit bias. These implicit biases can produce discriminatory behavior. That's why it's so important to understand how the mind processes information. Going back to the USDA non-discrimination statement, you definitely don't want something to unconsciously cause you to have a discriminatory behavior, which could lead to a possible discrimination complaint. Even though implicit biases occur in nearly everyone, because they occur on an unconscious level that you're not aware of, you don't realize that it actually has the potential to influence your decision making versus the facts of a situation. For those of us who may not be aware that this is happening unconsciously, it's important to recognize what is occurring and how to address it. If you're not paying attention, an implicit bias could affect your decision making. Previously, when I talked about stereotypes as they relate to explicit biases, these were things that you are aware of that are stereotypes that you may believe. Stereotypes categorize people by a variety of characteristics such as age, gender, race, income level, height, weight, or just about anything. Stereotypes are a way the mind works to sort new people or things into recognizable groups. For example, the stereotype that all tall people are athletic. We know that not all tall people are athletic, but if your personal experience is that the tall people you know all are athletic and are great at sports, the next time you meet a person that's tall, you may have a stereotypical belief that this person must be athletic. Not treating that person as an individual, but clumping them into a category based on a stereotype leads to the formation of an implicit bias. Some common stereotypes are racial profiling, gender profiling, or cultural stereotypes that lead to a belief that because a person belongs to a particular culture, group, or has a specific look, they must exhibit shared characteristics. You could also have a stereotype about groups of individuals. It could be a stereotype that only certain types of people go to a certain university, or it could be a stereotype about an organization or community group. Some examples of stereotypes in the application review process could be that grammatical errors in the application are indicative of an applicant's ability to complete quality work, or the assumption that a big name university has better academics and is more likely to complete a project. Not all stereotypes are negative. A positive stereotype could be the belief that a person who wears glasses is smart or they study a lot. It's not that these are bad characteristics, but a positive stereotype still creates bias because it's creating a predetermination that a person belongs in a particular category and relates to a prior experience that you had or something that you were exposed to. Remember, positive stereotypes are still a bias, and we should be actively taking steps to avoid allowing a bias to influence our actions. Where do implicit biases show up? Implicit biases can show up anywhere. They could show up in program delivery or the issuance of program benefits. Thinking about employment, implicit bias could show up in hiring and or recruitment. They could show up in performance reviews, or how or who is receiving mentoring. Implicit biases can show up in communications under the branding or marketing of a product. Implicit biases will certainly show up in someone's personal life. Remember, it's those life experiences that can form stereotypes that inform implicit biases. Implicit biases can affect how you interact with people during day-to-day interactions. They could even show up when evaluating proposals during the panel review process. How do biases operate? As I stated before, biases are shaped by prior experiences. Some of those experiences could be bad, and some of those experiences could be good. Based on these experiences, bias can affect your attitudes toward a behavior or group, or how proposals or applications are evaluated, or a variety of the things we talked about before. Bias can cause you to display differential treatment of others based on previous interactions, not even related to the new encounter. What's important to note is because those biases are unconscious, they aren't even related to the new person you met or the proposal someone submitted. You might not even know the person or institution that submitted the proposal, but if you had a prior negative experience with the institution and automatically and unconsciously relate negative experiences to the application, it could affect how it's evaluated. For example, maybe you read a research paper from a specific university that you thought was poorly done. You might unconscientiously categorize other things that come from the university as also being substandard. Or you may have prior experiences on a panel with a really great application and assume that an unrelated application that came from the same institution will also be great, unconscientiously influencing how you might view the application before even looking at it. Not allowing yourself the opportunity to see a new encounter as an individual new encounter and unconsciously grouping the new experience with the prior experience could form the basis for discrimination. This is how biases can influence or cause discriminatory behavior. Some of the outcomes of biases could be fewer participants in federally assisted programs. For example, let's say someone applied for federal grants and they go through the process and don't get selected. Maybe the feedback they received on their application wasn't as positive as they expected. This could lead to them becoming discouraged and not applying for federally assisted programs in the future. Maybe there was bias in the evaluation process, leading to proposals that could have been selected not being chosen, resulting in fewer awards being recommended for funding. Bias can also result in the needs of some communities being insufficiently addressed. Biases can lead to inequity when things are categorized unconscientiously and stereotypes or past unrelated experiences are considered. It is so important that we do everything we can to recognize and address implicit bias. We can't allow implicit bias to influence our actions or the decisions we make. Changing unconscious habits can lead to a more diverse and productive workforce. One strategy for changing behaviors and addressing the unconscious habits is to use the focus or FOCSE approach. When we're starting to work on changing unconscious habits, we need to be fair, open, cooperative, supportive, and empowered. If you're striving to be fair and open, when implicit biases come up, you are more likely to take actions to recognize and address those biases. We need to be cooperative and supportive. We may not recognize a bias, but if we're cooperative and supportive, others may feel more comfortable providing feedback, which can bring unconscious bias to our conscious mind. Finally, we need to feel empowered to combat unconscious bias. If we focus FOCSE on being fair, open, cooperative, supportive, and empowered, we will be better prepared to address unconscious bias from a conscious level. How can we address biases to make sure it's not affecting our decision-making process? Understanding what bias is and taking proactive steps to address it is the first step. Determine how bias may be affecting your decisions. You likely won't realize how bias is affecting your decisions or the potential it has to affect those decisions unless you recognize when it occurs. In order to recognize when bias occurs, you need to be able to consider gut reactions and how they can be indicative of an implicit bias. Once you recognize bias, you have to be willing to acknowledge that the bias is there and be comfortable with the uncomfortable feelings that may come with re-examining the root of the bias. Acknowledging the bias isn't enough. We must conscientiously consider ways to address the bias and set goals to eliminate them. Here are some additional strategies for reducing bias. You may want to consider both perspectives of a situation. Not only do you want to look at your perspective, but the perspective of the other side as well. Going back to the example of a tall person being more athletic, if my perception of someone that's tall, I might decide I want to pick that person to be on my team because I have this expectation that they will be athletic. The other person could be feeling a lot of pressure for being tall and think that everyone is going to choose them to be on their team because they're tall and they think they're athletic. But what if they're not athletic at all? That could set them up to possibly feel like a failure or make them feel bad if they don't perform to those expectations. Another strategy to reduce bias is to increase your collaborations with others not like you. This can be a huge benefit. A lot of time we go through life in our own little box or comfort zone where we tend to interact with others that are like us. We believe we know how they will react to our interactions or that we have shared perspectives. But what would really help us stretch and grow is collaborating with people that are different than you or I, because it allows us to learn from others and helps to combat implicit bias. You can also try stereotype replacement. When you recognize a stereotype, actively recall why that stereotype is false and think about an experience or occasion that disproves that stereotype. An additional strategy to reduce bias is to have continuous discussions to understand others. Understanding that we're all unique individuals that can't be placed into the same mold helps displace unconscious bias and can make us more inclusive of others. Understanding the importance of diversity can help us overcome our implicit biases and the effect biases can have on an organization. We'll discuss diversity a little more in an upcoming slide. Let's first discuss how to address biases during panel meetings. If you notice any bias in a panel discussion, notify the panel manager or national program lead. They are in a position to address those concerns. Because everyone has biases, it's important to remind panelists that the only criteria for evaluating an application is the criteria published in the RFA. Panelists need to set aside any prior information or perceptions about the application or the applicant they may have. Don't include any statements that could be perceived as bias in the written review or panel summary. Finally, if you believe that a bias that has already been reported wasn't adequately addressed during a panel meeting, notify the applicable division director. There is no place for bias in the panel process, and it is better to bring something up then than to remain quiet and allow a potential bias to affect a panel decision. What is diversity? A lot of times when diversity is mentioned, we tend to think of things like age, gender, mental or physical characteristics or abilities, sexual orientation, ethnicity, or race. These are often referred to as the primary dimensions of diversity. The primary dimensions of diversity are traits or characteristics that we are born with and are normally not easily modified. The secondary dimension of diversity are things that we may have some degree of control over. Looking at the graphic on the right side of the screen, you can see the primary dimensions of diversity are in the inner circle, and the secondary dimensions of diversity are in the outer ring. Some things that make up that secondary dimension of diversity include, but are not limited to, language, religion, income, work experience, family status, geographic location, organizational role, and many others. When we think about diversity, it's important to note it's important to not be constrained to that rigid inner circle and recognize there are many traits and characteristics that we develop from our experiences that make us diverse. What are the benefits of diversity? Groups with greater diversity tend to have greater innovation and creativity. This can come from the broader range of different perspectives that come together in a diverse group. At NIFA, we strive to bring diverse individuals together during the panel process. Bringing diversity to the panel process helps make the group more constructive. Establishing new partnerships is another way to leverage and benefit from diversity. Diversity also enhances collaboration, decision-making, individual, and team productivity. The primary goal of addressing bias is to ensure that we are diverse as well as inclusive. Again, diversity is the full spectrum of human differences, and inclusion is empowering people by respecting and appreciating what makes them different. Previously, we discussed the benefits of diversity, and we must remember to always strive for diversity and inclusion. Being part of a diverse group is not enough. We also have to be inclusive. We have to empower each other to share that diversity in our thoughts, words, and actions. We may not always agree, and that's what makes diversity so beneficial. Sharing different perspectives and learning from each other allows us to be our best versions of ourselves. While our opinions may differ, bringing different ideas and perspectives to the panel process helps us ensure the best outcome. Diversity success leads to cultural competency, which is the ability of an individual or organization to work effectively with individuals from a variety of backgrounds, including persons from different racial, ethnic, cultural, religious, or socioeconomic backgrounds, as well as persons with disabilities. What is important to note about cultural competency is that it is not an issue of access or even equity, but an issue of understanding. Understanding the value of diversity leads to cultural competence, and it's that cultural competency that brings everything together and allows individuals to contribute to their maximum potential. When the individuals that make up an organization are all contributing and performing their best, there is nothing the organization can't achieve. Cultural competency doesn't just benefit us professionally, but it also carries over to our personal lives and contributes to our personal growth as an individual. This concludes my presentation on implicit bias. Thank you for your time and attention. If you have any specific questions or would like to discuss a specific situation, please feel free to contact me via email or Teams at rudy.gonzalez@usda.gov. Thank you and have a great day.